Hello, and welcome to New Frame Plus. Let's talk about another of the 12 principles of animation. In previous videos, we explored the principles of timing, squash and stretch, anticipation. You know what? There's a playlist in the description. You don't need me to rattle these off every time. Today, we are going to talk about ARCS. It turns out, very few living organisms are naturally capable of movement with direct mechanical precision. Our bodies just aren't built to move in perfectly straight lines on a single axis. Instead, the various parts of our bodies tend to follow these slightly curved paths while traveling from point A to point B. Once the earliest animators had this realization, they increasingly found that describing and charting motion using these curved paths, or arcs, yielded significantly more natural feeling and appealing-looking character animation. That's pretty much the whole principle. Arcs describe the curved trajectories which all the parts of our bodies generally follow while in motion. Take walking, for example. If we track the position of various points on the body over time, we will usually find that those points are all following some sort of arcing path. This hand swinging back and forth, that's an arc. The elbow further up the arm, also an arc. The heel of the foot, it's got an arcing path of its own. And even the pelvis, our center of gravity, follows a smoothly oscillating path up and down with each stride. For the animator, these curves are a very useful tool for both understanding and recreating human body mechanics in our animation. And it kinda makes sense that our bodies move this way when you think about it. I mean, so much of our skeletal structure is basically these series of joints, one after another, each rotating or hinging at the sockets, each creating an arcing motion as they do so. No wonder it's so hard to move any part of our body in a perfectly straight line. Every joint involved in creating that motion is moving in an arc. This is another one of those animation principles which is largely about mimicking the rules of physics and the natural mechanics of our anatomy. Arcs help us to properly convey mass and the forces acting on that mass. If an animated character's movements don't follow arcs, if they just mechanically trace a linear path from one key pose to the next one, the results will feel stiff and incorrect. The weight of it will feel all wrong. But arcs aren't just important because they make organic motion look realistic. They also tend to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Smooth arcs lend animated motion a sense of fluidity that we really tend to like. And what's more, arcs can be exaggerated to push that appeal even further. Taking the arcs of motion our bodies naturally follow and amplifying them can make your character animation feel even more dynamic or graceful. It just tends to look really cool. Even when working with naturalistic characters and motion capture, smoothing and rounding out the arcs of their motion just a little bit can often make that animation look better. Weirdly, it can sometimes even make that motion feel more, quote, realistic to our eyes than the raw motion capture data looked. It's an odd phenomenon. Of course, the animator should be careful not to go overboard with these things. Real organic motion may follow arcs, but it is still complex, and filtering all of that complexity down into nothing but smooth, clean arcs can make that motion start to feel unnaturally floaty or weightless. And there are scenarios where you might not want your character's movements to follow an arc. Perfectly linear motion might feel pretty lifeless and mechanical, but if you're animating a machine of some sort, that might be exactly the look you want. Or maybe the object you're animating is being impacted by an external force, which would interrupt the smooth, arcing trajectory of their movement. Or maybe not having an arc would look really funny. Sometimes unnatural, incorrect motion just looks funny. Now, for the most part, arcs in game animation function in pretty much the same way as animation anywhere else. They make character motion look more natural and more appealing. And they can be instrumental in lending video game action more visual clarity. Have you ever wondered why so many attacks in 3D games involve these big swipes rather than more direct stabbing motions? It's because a stab only involves a single forward axis of motion, whereas a swipe, an arc, involves more of them, meaning that attack is going to be easier to read from more camera angles. And some game animations happen so fast that adding a motion trail, making the action's most important arc plainly visible to all players, can make that action read far clearer and look cooler. Likewise, interrupting and breaking arcs can be a great way to create contrast. When a character gets hit in an action game, most of the tricks we use to emphasize that impact, the quick snap to an exaggerated hit react animation, the hit stop, the shake, all of these tricks violently interrupt whatever arcs of motion preceded that impact, further emphasizing the hit. Of course, game animation does add some fun complications when it comes to applying this principle. For one thing, we don't always get to know where the camera is going to be. When you're animating characters in a film, you can fine-tune all of your arcs to look extra great to the only camera angle the audience is ever going to see. But if you happen to be animating on a 3D game with a player-controlled camera, well, the only way to make sure that your animation's gonna look good is to try to make those arcs look appealing from all angles, which can be tricky. And even after you have meticulously polished the arcs on every animation asset in the game, then you still have to contend with the challenge of making the arcs in those individual animations flow organically into one another, in an interactive context where the player is effectively choosing which animations happen and when. This has been one of game animation's most daunting technical challenges for a long time, because the human eye is annoyingly good at spotting those little erratic pops and jerks that can happen when parts of the body suddenly lurch from one arcing path to another one. And because arcs are so important to helping us sell a character's weight and size, the bigger and heavier the character's supposed to feel, the more those erratic pops between animations are going to just wreck the character's sense of weight. We do have tools for mitigating this problem, such as blends, transitions, inverse kinematics, real-time physics objects attached to the character which can provide some overlap continuity across the seams, all manner of complex animation systems under the hood, but this particular struggle is one that game animators are, unfortunately, probably never going to be completely rid of. As is often the case with animation for video games, creating an enjoyable interactive experience for the player sometimes requires aesthetic compromises. Even so, arcs are fundamental to the motion of the human body, and most organic creatures' bodies for that matter. And the more we mind the arcs in our character's animation, the more natural and appealing their motion will look. And with that, we have now covered half of the 12 principles of animation. If you have found these videos informative or helpful, then please consider subscribing or supporting the show more directly, like all of these wonderful patrons listed here. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.